From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here, and here's what we have for you today. K-State's Guy Allen will offer his updated outlook on U.S. grain export business. Following the USDA's latest International Grain Supply and Demand report, Guy says that the keystone customer, China, will remain an aggressive buyer of U.S. feed grains and soybeans for some time to come. Also, K-State's Terry Griffin on a new tool he's developed for estimating historic farmland value for a given year using the current value of that land. This tool can help one determine the tax liability of a farmland transaction. And K-State's Charlie Lee on a new study of extreme weather events and the ensuing impact on bird species. All that here on Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
While the CDC urges you to avoid close contact, like hugging or shaking hands, there are other non-physical ways to say hello. Wave, wink, use sign language, salute, smile, give the peace sign, throw up an air high five, do jazz hands. Remember, stay a minimum of 6 feet or 2 arms length away from others, and stay home if you can. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Good to have you along with us once more. This is Agriculture Today. Well, the USDA monthly posts its World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates for commodities, including the grains, and the grain trades in particular tend to sit up and take notice at those numbers, as does our guest now over from the IGP Institute here at Kansas State University, where he serves as the senior economist, Guy Allen. And Guy has pulled together some notes and reflections on what the numbers had to say and what they may mean for market direction moving forward now. Guy, let's begin with the grain that probably was the most uneventful when we look at the total summary of this report. That would be wheat. As you look at the international numbers, what are they telling you there?
Well, not too many surprises on the domestic side of things. International, we are seeing an increase in the supply and the production. We saw the supplies up about 3.3 million metric tons to 1,070 million metric tons on bigger crops in Australia and in Canada. And they were more than offsetting the shortfall that we saw in Argentina. Australia particularly, we're seeing a significant increase in production after they come out of 3 years of drought. USDA has it pegged at 28.5 million metric tons. This is the third largest wheat crop for them on record. The interesting thing to note on Australia, quite a number of analysts are suggesting the crop is even bigger, maybe closer to 30 million metric tons, and that's what I'd probably suggest as well. Canada's also seen an increase of 2 million metric tons up to 36 million metric tons, and this is their second largest crop on record. There's going to be a lot of wheat around the world. Argentina, we've seen a bit of a drop in their estimate, down 1 million tons to 19.5 on dry conditions and also a bit of frosty weather down there. Production estimates for the biggest wheat exporters in Russia, the Ukraine, and Kazakhstan were all left unchanged for the month.
Probably the more interesting, though, is on the demand side, where we're seeing, and you'll hear this country cited many times in our conversation, China picking up its import pace.
Yeah, China's USDA expects them to import 1 million more metric tons than last year, up to 7. If they're successful at importing 7 million metric tons, this will be the largest imports of wheat we've seen in China since 1995 and 96. So that's the one real optimistic view on things in the wheat market today.
Maybe the greater action is in the row crops, and let's start with the coarse grains, more narrowly corn here, and what the USDA is saying. What's jumping out to you as far as supplies are concerned there, Guy?
Yeah, the supplies in corn, we're expecting Brazil to increase their production by 3 million metric tons to about 110 million metric tons for the year. Ukraine's also just off slightly, just 1 million metric tons, and the EU is also down 1.5 million. That's going to add a little support to the market that we've seen in the last few weeks and should help the U.S. exports.
But as far as target markets are concerned, there again is China right in the thick and so active in this area of late.
Yeah, no, China is the key in the corn market as well as the soybean market, and we keep coming back to China, but they're probably the biggest unknown in the market, and in soybeans, the biggest player. But China is fairly interesting. They're in corn. They're the second largest producer of corn in the world. Between the U.S. and China, it's about 60% of total supply. The USDA increased their feed usage by about 2 million metric tons, which is on the back of particular recovery in their swine herd as they recover from that African swine fever situation, as well as support from other industries that are increasing in the animal production and that demand for feed. Now, an interesting point on corn is the expected China imports. USDA left their number at 7 million metric tons. However, if we look at our forward sales already on the books, we have 8.8 million tons just out of the U.S. for exports to China this coming marketing year. So something doesn't compute. Something just doesn't calculate quite right. And as I said last month, or maybe it was the month before, I'm quite optimistic China corn demand. I think we're going to be closer to the 20 million metric ton mark at the end of the day than at the 7 for total China imports. And I continue to be optimistic because of the demand coming from the feed sector. As they recover from the African swine fever, the other production in animal livestock is key. And I think an important point to highlight there, Eric, is about 50% of the hogs in China historically have been backyard production. Now, in the wake of this African swine fever and trying to control that, backyard hog production has virtually been eliminated and made illegal because that's where we had a rapid expansion of that contagion in the African swine fever. So we've seen a significant paradigm shift in the whole industry in China to commercial production. And commercial livestock production, particularly commercial hogs, uses imported corn and imported soybean meal. It's in the supply chain. Your backyard production is sort of what I refer to as the invisible supply chain, and you never really see that demand come to market. Mm-hmm. But when it enters into the commercial realm of animal production, that's definitely there, in the pipeline. You see that demand come to market, and they're positioned to use large volumes of imported corn and soybean meal as well as the domestically produced stuff. So that keeps me quite optimistic.
Yeah. And the long-term ramifications of that will be interesting to witness as we move forward. For sure.
Yes, yeah, no, and I think it's not only impacting the domestic livestock sector in China, but the trade relations on that. And I think corn's going through a similar evolution to what soybeans did about 25 years ago.
Yeah. And before we leave coarse grains, we have to note that China is prominent there in as far as importing sorghum.
Yes, China has been the dominant buyer of U.S. sorghum for the last few months. We're seeing sorghum prices priced higher than corn at Texas Gulf, as well as in western Kansas. We're seeing exceptionally strong basis levels still, both in corn and grain sorghum. I think that's a reflection of slow farmer selling in the wake of the lower prices we've had, and hopefully as we now enter harvest and some higher prices, some farmers will be letting go and pricing some grain here. But on the sorghum crop, USDA reduced their yield about 2.7 bushels per acre, taking it down to 73.9. Their production's smaller at about 358 million bushels. That's going to continue to lend support to those sorghum prices. I've got to remain optimistic for grain sorghum, not only in the near term, but I think China's going to be there in the longer term for grain sorghum as well.
Well, roll it on over to the oilseeds, soybeans primarily here. And the USDA did update its production estimate for our main competitor, and that would be Brazil, right?
Yeah, Brazil's expected to produce a record soybean crop, which is no surprise. And that record crop's going to be about 133 million metric tons. In the wake of that, we're also going to have more export competition coming out of Brazil. It's 1 million tons higher at 85 million metric tons of soybeans. That export number is unchanged from last month, but I think it's a good reminder that we've got quite a bit of competition in the southern hemisphere. No changes in our other competitor down south from Argentina. It's pretty much left unchanged. Import expectations from China were basically left steady at 99 million metric tons. That's a million metric tons higher than last year's forecast. It's going to leave us with a fairly comfortable carryout of about 93.6 million metric tons, which is about 2.5 million metric tons less than last year. I think the real key driver on the oilseed situation is coming from palm oil. Palm oil, we've seen a drop in production there. We've seen a significant price rally in palm oil, which is lending good support to soybean oil and across that whole oilseed complex. And that's what's really been the leader in this, in sort of the products and the complex, is this palm oil situation.
So you consider that, and also noting that China has been ultra-aggressive in purchasing U.S. soybeans of late. Is the U.S. positioned favorably, particularly in advance of that forthcoming Brazil crop, which is still months down the road?
Yeah. Also, looking at that, we have continued to see good demand, particularly for meal exports and oil out of the U.S., so we're pushing our crush capacity to near record levels as well. Crush margins are staying relatively healthy, and that's got to keep us fairly optimistic for not only export demand for soybeans, but for our domestic demand as well.
So then, Guy, in closing, as soybean harvest ensues here in the coming weeks, will producers be witnessing $10 beans?
Well, I'd like to think we're going to see $10 a bushel soybeans at your elevator, depending on where you're at in your local basis. But look, we're flirting pretty close to that $10 level on the futures. I think if China continues to be there every day like they have been, we're increasingly giving the market confidence that that demand is there, and I think we're going to see an opportunity to price soybeans above $10.
Very well. Well, Guy posts regularly on the agmanager.info website his notes and observations in international commodity markets, including the grains. And once more, he's updated that with the latest information out of the USDA on supply and demand. So check that out, agmanager.info. We always appreciate you coming over and visiting with us, Guy. Many thanks.
Thank you, Eric.
He's the senior economist with the IGP Institute here at Kansas State University. Guy Allen, our first guest on this Tuesday edition of Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local Extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today continues now, and once more we have a chance to visit with precision agricultural economist, K-State Research and Extension, Terry Griffin. Terry has come up with yet one more useful tool for you producers to use, which is now housed at the agmanager.info website. And this one revolves around the premise, Terry, of using USDA Farmland Value data for farm management decision-making purposes. What kind of opportunity is this presenting to producers, this tool?
So over the last several years, I've been on your show and discussing a range of extension fact sheets that we've put on Ag Manager, and those fact sheets are just that. They're, at best, if you print them off, they're on paper. There's some description on how to make calculations to estimate farmland value. Let's say if you knew the value at any point in history, or if you knew the value today and you needed to estimate the value of when it was inherited sometime in the past. Those were some good instructionals, but that's kind of where it ended. The user still had to do the arithmetic and make sure that they had everything lined up mathematically correctly. So what we did was built a interactive dashboard on Ag Manager so that the user, whether it's a farmer, landowner, or people who work as accountants, I'm getting calls from different people who are trying to estimate tax liability for stepped-up basis. And I've been referring them to the beta version of this website, which is now, I'm pleased to say, live on Ag Manager. And so the user can sit down and choose what type of a analysis and calculations that they desire to do, and it lays it out really in a step-by-step way. There's instructions, but the arithmetic and the calculations happen behind the scenes.
This is based on utilizing farmland values for the purposes of farm management decision-making. In what sense? Could you explain that?
All right, so if you go to the immediate website, you'll come to the description page, and it has listed 3 of the fact sheets that we have used to build upon this. The first 2 are estimating farmland values based upon historic data from USDA NASS. We have 2 listed, one for Kansas that Michael and I put together, and one for Arkansas, where I was previously, that Scott Stiles co-authored with me. Now he's continuing to update that every year. And the third one on this list is one I did with Tiffany Lashmet. Tiffany joined me on your show, 2-3 years ago?
Right.
And the title of that was Estimating Tax Liability Using Stepped-Up Basis. And it was a nice little 2-page fact sheet. We had maybe 48 pages of tables, one for each state. It was intended to estimate the tax liability for when someone considered to sell their farmland that they had inherited sometime in the past. Well, all this data we're using comes from USDA NASS. Every August, the data is updated from a survey that NASS conducts in January. So in January 2020, there was a survey that was conducted. It was reported in August of 2020, but really it was about 2019 farmland values. So looking on the left-hand side of our new dashboard, when you get to the website, if you want to take a look, is a graph. And by default, it comes up with Kansas. But, listeners who are in Nebraska, Oklahoma, or California, for that matter, anywhere across the lower 48 states can choose what state that they're interested in. And there's a graph that goes back to 1950 that's interactive that compares the state against the average of all states in the United States. Also on the left-hand side, there's 2 calculators, one for estimating farmland values based upon these numbers. And the second calculator is more specialized. It's what Tiffany and I put together for calculating the stepped-up basis when we've inherited farmland and we wanted to get an idea of how much it's appreciated since the inheritance, because that's how taxes are derived from that. There's 2 boxes. One box asks, what state are you in? What year did you inherit the farmland? So let's say 1987 is the default, and it asks for, did you get it appraised? And if you did, what year? So we say, 2019 was appraised, and for how much? And plug in a value, let's say $2,000, and it's appreciated a lot since 1987. And it will ultimately tell us that the estimated farmland value at inheritance in 1987 is $381. It has gone up since then, but the taxable value is only $1,619 because taxes are not owed for the value before the inheritance. So it's a pretty quick way for accountants and landowners to sit down and to get an estimate. I will reiterate that it's an estimate, but I think it will hold up to give some good perspective on valuation and especially on a stepped-up basis. We do recommend consulting with a professional for getting a appraisal that would be used. But many times appraisals were not conducted the year of inheritance, so we have to kind of backwards calculate and make some assumptions.
By the way, since you bring that point up, you stress that this series of indices should not be used as a substitute for bona fide professional land appraisals. Those are still essential here.
They are. There's not a workaround, but in my mind, it's a good educational tool that we use to get an estimate, get an idea, but a professional appraisal would be the one that we would put the highest value as far as data quality on. But it gives you an idea of differences in farmland values for each of the states. And when you go to the website, you can hover your mouse over the states and have a pop-up box telling you what state it is, as well as the value in whatever year that you've selected. And for those who are really interested in data analysis, the last tab, you can download the data for the state, for all the states, as a CSV to bring into Excel or other specialized software to do additional analysis on your own. So we're trying to make it as simple as possible, useful as possible, as well as providing the user with opportunity to do advanced analyses on their own.
Once more, for taxation purposes on a parcel of land for certain, but this could be utilized in a variety of ways, anything to do with farmland transactions then.
Sure. This tool right now focuses on farmland value per acre. As time goes by, this tool will have additional calculators, will have county level information. And I want it to be more than just for Kansas, because when we built this, the same amount of effort will get you one state as it will all states. So we thought, well, let's just build this for all states and not just Kansas. And I do need to iterate that I'm not the only one who built this. The original version was built by one of our graduate students. Emrah has built the original version. I've expanded it. And we have other faculty who are investing effort to develop more tools that were added to this.
It's out there. It's available for use by anybody. It's at the agmanager.info website. And specifically, as they go to that web page, is there not a handy link right there on the front to this tool?
Yes, you can go to agmanager.info and you can navigate to this dashboard from Ag Manager. Or you can go directly to this dashboard itself. It's one of our Shiny tools. Shiny is a relatively new way of doing interactive dashboards. Shiny is spelled S-H-I-N-Y, and it's shiny.agmanager.info, and this tool will be /farmland. And we'll have some other tools other than farmland tools developed soon. The Data Suitable for Fieldwork in Kansas graphs are also on Shiny, and it's available through agmanager.info.
So a number of things coming out of that chute, but one of the first is, again, this tool which allows one to look at USDA farmland value data, and it'll help that data in assessing a tax valuation and a tax liability for a farmland transaction and other useful functions as well. So producers, you should check it out. That's at agmanager.info. And you are just embarking, as you're suggesting, Terry, on a whole suite of new ideas under these dashboard programs. So we'll be looking for more from you along this line in the not-too-distant future. Thanks for telling us about this today.
Thanks, Eric. It's good to be here. And I look forward to hearing what your listeners have to say about this. They want to contact me to get some more information.
Provide feedback, by all means, producers. Terry Griffin with us, Precision Agricultural Economist, K-State Research and Extension. His contact information as well can be found at agmanager.info. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and we will return with more on the K-State Radio Network.
With the shortage of primary care physicians, especially in rural areas, health education and disease prevention are vital. K-State Research and Extension programs address quality of life, personal development, and health behaviors across all life stages of all social-economic groups. To learn more about health education, one of K-State Research and Extension's 5 grand challenges, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Welcome back to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Next up for you, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. And we've the latest Kansas crop progress and condition update from the USDA. For the week ending this past Sunday, our topsoil moisture supplies were called 5% surplus, 58% adequate, 37% short to very short. Subsoil moisture at 3% surplus, 57% adequate, and 40% short to very short. Winter wheat planting, 2% complete in the state now. The state of the corn crop, 54% good to excellent this week, 28% fair, 18% poor to very poor. Corn harvesting has now reached 8% in the state, corn mature at 49%. Soybean crop condition, 51% good to excellent, 34% fair, 15% poor to very poor. Soybeans now dropping leaves at 32%. That is, by the way, well ahead of the 19% average for this date. And grain sorghum in Kansas, 62%, still good to excellent, 28% fair, 10% poor to very poor. Sorghum now reaching maturity at 17%, and the grain sorghum harvested is now at 1% complete. Range and pasture conditions, 42% good to excellent, 37% fair, and 21% poor to very poor, according to this week's account from the USDA. As for the status of corn and soybean crops nationally now, we turn once again to the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
Condition ratings for the nation's corn and soybean crops are down.
The U.S. corn condition dropping ever so slightly during the week ending September 13th. We saw a 1 percentage point increase in the very poor to poor ratings, a 1 point drop in the good to excellent ratings. That continues a recent trend, largely due to drought.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says nationally, corn condition numbers are 60% good to excellent and 15% very poor to poor. Meanwhile,
good to excellent ratings for soybeans, 63%. That is down 2 percentage points from last week. 11% very poor to poor. That's up a point from a week ago. That does compare still favorably to last year.
He points to issues with both corn and soybean conditions in North Dakota.
That may reflect some of the freeze injury for the portion of the crop that was not yet fully mature.
He added that corn conditions continue to drop in Iowa because of a drought and the August derecho. This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
The Trump administration made it official yesterday, announcing in an EPA news release that the agency will deny all pending gap year small refinery exemptions to the renewable fuel standard for the years 2011 through 2018. The EPA has yet to decide the fate of 31 pending waiver requests for 2019 and 20, but this announcement does end a long period for the ethanol and agricultural industries wondering what would happen from here with those proposed exemptions. The ethanol industry stood to lose billions of gallons of fuel demand had those waivers been granted. In addition, the agency said that it's taking steps to update E15 labels to ensure consumers have informed choices at the pump when it comes to expanded E15 use. Back on Saturday, the president announced in a tweet that the EPA would be allowing E15 to be sold in existing E10 pump infrastructure. The agency has not yet made an official announcement on that. And the 2021 National Western Stock Show has been canceled due to health and safety restrictions. The 115th National Western will be delayed 1 year. It's set to take place in January of 2022, according to a news release from the event's organizers. The Western Stock Show Board of Directors, together with the National Western Stock Show management, made that decision as they reviewed several options, including a modified show with reduced capacity, according to the president and CEO of the show, Paul Andrews. But with health and safety being their top priority, the show and the city of Denver, he said, could not find a path forward to have the show and comply with the rules governing large gatherings and social distancing. Now for you, this week's edition of Milk Lines with K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning the calves. As we move into the fall season, we're starting to see some cooler temperatures, and while it's welcome relief from the summer heat, it's also a concern for the youngest members of our dairy herd out there in the pens. I really like to look at this in three different levels when I look at calves in the fall. Look at it from an environment standpoint, a nutrition standpoint, and then finally vaccinations. When it comes to environment, we all know that calves really do better if they're in a clean, dry environment that is also draft-free. Well, in the fall, that becomes an issue because we generally have moisture, so sometimes we don't keep up on the bedding, and yes, we end up with some wet calves. Well, the problem with that is that wetness generally exposes them to other additional bacteria. And in addition, we may see some animals that get chilled, so you have added stress that is put on them. And keep in mind that for small calves, their thermal neutral zone is much higher than that of cows. So, 70 degrees and wind actually probably can be pretty cold on their skin and in their environment. They can actually suffer some stress because of that. So that's one thing on the scale that could tip them in the wrong direction. How about the nutrition program? With the accelerated feeding programs that we use today, we're generally better at providing excellent nutrition for our calves. However, maybe you're not on one of those programs. Maybe you're still on the standard kind of 2 quarts of milk replacer or milk twice a day. Well, that'll usually keep the calf alive, but it's not going to give them too much extra. So if you haven't considered an accelerated growth program for your calves, that extra nutrition is really, really important, helping them to fight off the stresses that we generally see in the fall. And then the final thing I'd encourage you to take a look at is just your vaccination program. Not that vaccinations are the cure-all for everything. However, it's probably a good time to sit down with your veterinarian and just review what you're doing with your calves. Is it appropriate for your herd, or are there some additional things that you need to stress as you look at ways to prevent things like diarrhea and respiratory diseases in your calves? And then finally, are you using the right revaccination schedule or booster schedule, and making sure that you're using the right products and using them in the right way? It's very, very important in protecting your calves. And keep in mind, we're talking about calves, that also goes back to the dry cows, making sure that you review that dry cow vaccination program with your veterinarian as well, as the colostrum that we feed those calves at first is very, very important in the development of an immune system that will carry them till they can develop their own. This is Mike Brook with K-State Research and Extension, reminding our dairy farmers in Kansas that it's time to review what we're doing with our calves, making sure that they're able to withstand the stresses of the fall environment.
Many thanks, Mike. And this is Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so if you have a fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going in. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Coming your way now on Agriculture Today, K-State Research and Extension Wildlife Specialist Charlie Lee. He's aboard every Tuesday to talk wildlife management with us. Charlie, you're going to share data from a new study that's just been released on avian responses to weather extremes. And this has been prompted by some of the more excessive weather events that we've seen in recent years, you say.
Well, we know that modern climate change is increasing the frequency and the intensity of these extreme weather events. Those weather events would include things like the summer heat waves, droughts, and then the high rainfall events, which may result in flooding. There's not been very many studies that consider or look at how species are responding to those weather extremes compared with other dimensions of climate change. But those that have been done show that extreme weather has direct consequences for the species and those associated wildlife communities. We know that extreme weather can contribute to population declines. We know it can also impact reproductive success. But we also need to understand about the time scale there, the temporal values that are associated with these weather extremes. Is the event a weekly event? Is it a monthly event? Or is it a season-long event? We know that the biological response by birds could cause those birds to increase or reduce their activity, including the feeding and calling. We know that birds can experience die-offs, particularly among young birds or nestlings or other vulnerable members of that avian population. And we know that the distribution may change, that species may shift their distributions north or to higher elevations, and local populations could experience a high turnover. So those are all some predicted responses as a result of these extreme weather conditions.
To add to that information, though, you say that a study was recently finished and released by two universities, University of Wisconsin and Cornell, looking at this temporal factor, to put it that way, and using what's called citizen science. You might explain that.
Those particular researchers used occurrence data or information collected on a website called eBird, where participants can log in, put in the pertinent data of location, number of birds that are observed. Lots of information can be collected there, and then it's made available as a data set available to researchers. They compiled over 800,000 checklists that were contributed to this eBird website between 2004 and 2018 in eastern North America during June, and then they integrated that data with high-resolution temperature and precipitation changes from averages that were summarized over 3 temporal scales. And that would have been during the week, which would have been a 7-day period, during the month, a 30-day time frame, and then the seasonal would have been 3 months or 90 days. And they compared those with the averages from that 1980 to 2003 time frame. So I think that was kind of a novel approach to looking at the responses of bird species, which was numbered over 100, to the extreme variability in temperature and precipitation across a broad expanse of the eastern United States. Most of the data that we've collected before has been very localized, and thus it's kind of difficult to get some generalizations established.
But this data shows that there are clear biological responses by these species that were recorded.
Well, they did find that birds respond to temperature across all of those temporal scales, but the responses to precipitation were largely limited to monthly and seasonal scales. When we looked at all species, temperature effects were on the average more important than precipitation at the weekly and monthly scales, which is consistent with other work that demonstrates that bird communities respond more strongly to temperature than precipitation over shorter time periods. They also found that precipitation was more important at a seasonal scale, and they suggested that long-term impacts of drought and flooding were probably driving those species distributions. The responses to precipitation extremes can be rare over short time periods because drought and high rainfall events are less likely to occur in a single week than they would be on a monthly or seasonal basis. They also determined that shorter distance migrants and residents reduce their occurrence following extremely hot weeks, and that migrants that fly longer distances probably have reduced physiological flexibility compared with resident birds because they're adapted to a narrower range of climatic variability.
So that is quite a spectrum of impacts as far as how climate extremes can influence bird behavior. And you think then that this needs to be considered when one looks at longer-term population management of bird species?
Yes, I think that we need to take into consideration some of these extreme weather events and what they're going to do long-term, but as well we need to consider what those impacts may be short-term and mid-term, which would be either monthly or seasonal basis. It seems that over time we're more concerned with a 5 and 10-year type change in population numbers and distributions, and perhaps to get a true handle on what's causing those long-term changes, we need to look at maybe a shorter time interval. Once we understand the cause of some of these biological responses, then we can perhaps come up with management changes that will be able to reduce some of these swings in populations.
Well, there's a glance at a 15-year review of data on bird behavior and responses to weather extremes. And Charlie, thanks for sharing this with us today. Wildlife Specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Charlie Lee. And with that, today's edition comes to a close. As always, thanks for being along with us. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.